Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 4th Annual George W. Hunt Prize Award Ceremony and Lecture. I'm Sister Jen Schaff, one of the assistant chaplains here at St. Thomas More Catholic Chapel at Yale. Unfortunately, Father Bob Beloin, our chaplain, is unable to be present with us tonight due to a serious illness. The Hunt Prize was inspired by Faye Vincent Jr. and continues to be a collaboration between St. Thomas More and America Magazine. We are grateful to have the selection committee who have the honor and challenge of reading through the many writings of the nominees here with us tonight. It is now my pleasure to welcome Father Matt Malone, the president and editor-in-chief of America Media, who will introduce the Hunt Prize honoree.
My brothers and sisters, thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you, Sister, for your introduction. It is once again a real consolation to join you and to enjoy your hospitality, to join Philip and Jessica, his wife, and his parents, Bill and Therese, as we celebrate the awarding of this prize. Of course, my only regret is that Father Bob Beloin can't be with us tonight. Bob is a champion of this prize, and he has been from its inception. And America Media and I are very, very grateful for his constant support and his wise counsel, and most of all, his friendship. I think at a time when the church and the world are looking for models of good priests and decent men, none of us need to look further than Father Bob Beloin. We are very pleased at America Media to co-sponsor this project with St. Thomas More Chapel and Center at Yale University. And we really gather here to honor a legacy. It's a legacy of journalistic excellence, of the passionate pursuit of the truth, of a never-ending curiosity that stretched from the works of Cheever and Updike to the latest artistic trends, to news and events, and even the music of Frank Sinatra. And this, of course, is the legacy of Father George W. Hunt, S.J., a son of Yale, and the longest tenured editor-in-chief of America Magazine. Yet the only thing closer to George's heart than the written word were the many friendships he made throughout his life. And it is really through one of those friendships that we gather here this evening. It is with deep appreciation that we recognize the generosity of Faye Vincent, a trustee of St. Thomas More Chapel and Center at Yale, and a longtime friend of George's, for the leadership gift that made the Hunt Prize really a reality. The George W. Hunt Prize for Excellence in Journalism, Arts, and Letters is awarded to the most accomplished members of the literary world, authors who reflect a Catholic imagination. And this year's Hunt Prize, which was designated for historical criticism, goes to a native New York and a graduate of Dartmouth, currently a fellow at the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and currently writing a novel about the post-9/11 activities of the United States in Colombia. In 2005, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps. In January 2007, he deployed to Iraq, the 2nd Marine Logistics Unit, as a public affairs officer, and served overseas for 13 months, returning in February 2008. He attended Hunter College's MFA program in creative writing and became a Hodder Fellow at Princeton University and later a lecturer in Princeton's program in creative writing. His work has appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Brookings Institution's Brookings Essay Series, and of course, America Magazine. In 2014, his short story collection, Redeployment, was published and won that year's National Book Award for fiction. One of his nominators, who had published an essay, said this about him. Immediately after we published the piece, I began hearing about his essay. The elegant prose and quiet empathy in his piece got through to many more people than our essays normally do. In fact, it has supplanted all others we have published in terms of reader reaction. That's quite a testament. Yes, indeed. Before formally awarding the prize, America Media has commissioned a short film introducing our recipient.
I always wrote, so I don't think of myself as a Marine who turned into a writer. I think that that was always important to me, though deploying did change the way that I write. Rodriguez didn't approach me because he wanted to talk to a chaplain. I don't even think he recognized who I was until I stood up straight and he saw the cross on my collar. At first, he only wanted a cigarette. Prayer in the Furnace starts with a chaplain of a unit in Ramadi, which is a very, very violent place. And one of the Marines comes to him and he tells him about how this unit has been operating, and then suggests that Marines in his unit have killed civilians, and follows the relationship between this priest and this one Marine. Rage is good for amping you up before a fight, but something different happens once the fighting begins. There's a kind of joy to it, a surrender. It's not a particularly Christian feeling, but it's a powerful one. Physical aggression has a logic and emotion of its own. That's what I was seeing on Rodriguez's face. The space between when rage ends and violence begins. A Catholic writer is a writer who is Catholic in a serious way, where his or her Catholicism informs their creative imagination. That doesn't mean they're writing always a story about a priest, right? It doesn't mean that you're writing a story that's going to show people doing it right, or even mentioning God or religion. As a Vietnam veteran once wrote, it's less that there's no atheists in foxholes, but rather that war can bring you to a moment of choosing, right? Of saying, I must believe in a God who brought me through this, or I cannot believe in a God who would allow this. That's the really important thing, that question and that grappling, right? Of course, if you're writing, you're going for a certain aesthetic quality. You are trying to grapple with kind of moral issues and values at the core of people. But there's also, you have a sense that there's a spiritual component to human being. That is a basic aspect of human experience. I came home for vacation and I went straight to New York, which is really just very bizarre, right? Just strange to go from Anbar Province, Iraq to walking down Madison Avenue. That was tremendously alienating and weird. I met a photographer, and when I told him about that, he was like, oh yeah, no, you never go straight to New York after a combat zone. But when I came back from Iraq at the end of my deployment, things only became much more strange after I left the Corps. Living life in New York and looking kind of retrospectively back at these wars when they're not done. Finally, there was just this sort of sense of this thin public conversation happening at home. So it was sort of like, I'm going to come and I'm going to tell, people what they need to know about Iraq, right? Not that I knew what people needed to know about Iraq, and certainly the writing of the book made you even less certain. And part of the reason that I wrote 12 stories from 12 different narrators is, these are 12 guys who wouldn't agree with what war experience means. When somebody reads a book like mine, hopefully they enter into an experience. They spend a long time imagining what it is like to grapple with these experiences, to see the kind of collision of values that war experience entails, and then they make their own decision about how to respond to that. I don't think war is beyond words. I think that we like to imagine that it is. There's a kind of mysticism around war. But actually what it does is it just builds a neat little box around the veteran and shuts them up. When in fact what we really need to do if we want to be serious about war, and also if we want to be serious about treating veterans in our community with basic respect and empathy and the assumption that they're a part of our community, is we need to assume that there are things that are communicable. It's not as though you go to war and the gods of war come and they give you a new soul that is somehow different and distinct from civilian souls, right? You've still got the same emotional palette. So, when people say, civilians can't understand, what can't they understand? They can't understand love, they can't understand camaraderie, they can't understand fear, they can't understand guilt. They can understand all of those things, right? Sin is a lonely thing, a worm wrapped around the soul, shielding it from love, from joy, from communion with fellow men and with God. The sense that I am alone, that none can hear me, none can understand, that no one answers my cries. It is a sickness over which, to borrow from Bernanos, the vast tide of divine love, that sea of living, roaring flame which gave birth to all things, passes vainly. Your job, it seems, would be to find a crack through which some sort of communication can be made, one soul to another. I don't know if the American public is necessarily more interested now than they have been in the past. I think that's actually one of the challenges of a war that drags on as long as these wars have. We can't anesthetize ourselves to some aspects of creation without crippling ourselves in other ways. To take our obligations to our fellow man seriously means knowing we will never be able to adequately respond. It means knowing at all times that we should be moving towards a revolutionary change of heart for the strength to act more fully, directly, and powerfully in relation to the agony existing not just overseas, but in the divided communities where we live. It means knowing we will fail, and knowing the glory of creation is there for us anyway. It means accepting that being responsive to suffering and attuned to joy are not different things, but one and the same thing.
My brothers and sisters, on behalf of the trustees of America Media and the St. Thomas More Chapel and Center at Yale University, it is our pleasure to present the 2018 George W. Hunt S.J. Prize for Excellence in Journalism, Arts, and Letters to Philip W. Klay. Congratulations.
Thank you. This is amazing. Just tremendously special to me to receive this award, to be recognized as a Catholic writer in particular. Thank you to everyone at St. Thomas More, at America Media, to the people on the committee that picked me. Thank you very much. And thank you for everything that you do. It's a very nervous subject to talk about, especially, in a Catholic audience, they want you to be quick. So it started in the middle of the night. The U.S. Army surrounded the homes, established perimeters, and posted heavy weaponry at key positions, dividing the space around their targets into neat geometric kill zones. But their targets were not terrorist hideouts. They were the houses of families. And so instead of kicking down doors or blowing locks out with shotguns, they knocked. They roused the families inside, waking husbands and wives, grandparents and young children. They pressed money into their hands, told them, "You have no choice, you have to leave, so pack." And then the soldiers stood in the families' living rooms and watched as they left, carrying bags, sometimes leaving behind clothes and keepsakes in their haste. Behind the army came the engineers, They built large earthen barriers, laid out concrete blast walls, placed sandbags around windows, set up radio and data connections to headquarters. In short, converted these former homes into small, defensible outposts. Where once children were raised, where husbands and wives argued and made love, there was now an armed camp of foreigners staring out from behind automatic weapons. This was April 2007. In a series of tiny towns south of Fallujah, the people there had lived through the American invasion, through the multi-sided insurgency, through the growing consolidation of power by the Islamic State. Recently, someone had taken 40 people from the towns, bound them, shot them, and left their bodies in a mass grave. And now the people who remained, poor rural people, had new neighbors. When they woke up, the physical geographies of their towns had hardly changed, but the social geography had undergone an earthquake. The old power structure in those towns was the Islamic State, and it had offered jobs and opportunities. $40 for laying a roadside bomb, more if that bomb blew up and killed or injured an American. Controlled smuggling routes and black markets. It had offered the potential for a farmer or mechanic to work in an insurgent cell, rise up through the ranks, become a person worthy of power and respect. It had offered an ideological and religious appeal and a way to challenge foreign invaders. And if you crossed it, it had offered torture and murder. And this had allowed them to rule. But now it was being challenged. But who exactly was doing the challenging? It may seem obvious that American troops were the new power players in the region. After all, what was that night of forced displacements and rapid construction if not a show of power? A new boss was in town, and he wore an American flag on his sleeve, right? That's what I thought at the time. I came in a military convoy 2 days later, looking out at the surrounding area from behind thick bulletproof glass. When we arrived at one of those new combat outposts, COPs, they were called, I sat in on a briefing given by leadership to discuss plans moving forward. The essence of war is imposing order onto an inherently chaotic environment. And from inside the COP, everything seemed very orderly and very controlled. We could look out at the surrounding town from towers covering every angle of approach with interlocking fields of fire. We had maps and satellite imagery and a blue force tracker which provided real-time data on the location of friendly forces. We had an intelligence section, which had mapped out every violent incident on every street and highway in the past couple of years. To the inhabitants of the town, perhaps, the changes we had wrought were bewildering and frightening. Perhaps they were looking at us in fear and confusion, but within the COP, behind our walls and weapons, stuffed full of data, sitting on some former townsperson's couch and listening to the briefing, there was no confusion. We could look out with what seemed like an objective, God's eye view. We were in the town, of course, but not a part of it. The town was an object in our grasp, a text we could read. But that feeling of power only lasted as long as you stayed inside the COP, surrounded by comforting maps and data. When it came time to leave, I walked outside the walls to where our vehicles were waiting and stood for a moment in the street. I looked at the Marines around me, performing their pre-convoy checks on their vehicles and weapons, and then turned to the town surrounding us. There was a small road that intersected with the main street that we were on, and it ran straight for a bit before curving off into the distance. I felt a desire to start walking down that road, to just wander off from my unit and explore. A feeling that in that time and place felt somewhat akin to the odd desire one feels standing on the edge of a cliff or tall building, where that little voice whispers perversely, "Jump." This moment of vertigo was an intimation that perhaps we were not quite the new boss in town I imagined we were. Certainly, we had the most firepower, the greatest capability for effectively wielding violence. Simone Weil once defined force as that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. Under that definition, you could certainly say that we were the dominant force in the region. What is much more disputable, however, is whether we were the dominant power. Power and the use of force are often conflated. Power grows out of the barrel of a gun, said Mao. Only violence pays, claimed Fanon. However, there's another very different conception. All governments rest on opinion, James Madison claimed. A statement is true for democracies as for monarchies and totalitarian states. In this conception, the strength of a society and therefore the degree of power its government can yield relies on the consent of the governed far more than on the constant looming threat of violence. Indeed, States that rely on that constant threat, like North Korea, are notable for their weakness, their crippling need to internally police dissent to keep the house of cards from falling down. What to make, then, of my situation, staring down a dusty side street in a tiny, poor town bordered by desert? I knew that no matter all the information we had, maps, Blue Force trackers, intelligence reports, and timelines of significant events, and no matter the tremendous show of force the town had just witnessed, there was not a single Marine or soldier behind me who would feel comfortable walking down that road alone. That simple physical space, a road in a town, the sort of thing that to me had always seemed no more than poured and hardened concrete, took on a new depth. The road was not a physical geography, but the location of a complex social life, a set of relationships, of customs, traditions, rituals, crafts, stories, songs, and practices, all of which, of course, were foreign to me. None of these things seemed important until I stepped outside the walls of the COP. They only exist as long as they're lived, and so they can't be easily charted by a military intelligence cell printed on a map and pinned to a wall. Nevertheless, they barred me from the town as surely as our blast walls and earthen barriers excluded the town from our COP. They were not only real, they were dangerous. And as Mao also pointed out, insurgents move amongst the people as fish swim in the sea. So walking through a town without having an intuitive sense of the people could feel like driving in a foreign country at high speed down a narrow highway, full of dark turns over steep cliffs, and suddenly realizing that you don't know whether you're supposed to drive on the left or right side of the road. In movies and television, war tends to be portrayed in terms of violent action. Firefights and raids and slow-motion sniper bullets flying across the battlefield to kill the enemy. And it's understandable why. The exercise of violence, unlike the accumulation and use of social power, offers a satisfying narrative structure. A raid, a combat raid, is a morality play with a beginning, middle, and end in which a set of brave warriors prepare for battle, strike their objective, and end the life of a bad guy. No wonder, then, that in our deeply unsatisfying, never-ending wars, the most popular cultural offerings are movies like Zero Dark 30 and American Sniper, where we are treated to the spectacle of highly trained operatives killing undoubtedly evil people, bomb makers and torturers and sadists and thugs of all stripes, while the communities in which these fights happen is rendered almost invisible. In American Sniper, there's barely a civilian to be found. Even the young children in that movie are actively engaged in trying to kill Americans. I met a lot of kids in Iraq. Not one of them tried to kill me. And so the viewer need not worry about the complexities of waging war in and around people's homes. The city in these films is not a social space, but a hostile landscape, which the soldier must dominate through brute force. And once the army has rampaged through the whole of the city, and the enemies have been killed or driven away, well, that's victory. This can be fun to watch on television. The problem is that in real life it often doesn't work. In the Second Battle of Fallujah, Marines and soldiers fought their way through that city, close to 2,000 insurgents, 800 civilians, and about a little over 100 coalition forces were killed. It was the bloodiest battle involving U.S. forces since the Vietnam War. But by 2006, the city was once again firmly controlled by the Islamic State. Aside from the structural damage all over the city, it was as if we'd never fought our way through it at all. And so, by the time I was in Iraq, the military had come up with a new strategy, formalized in the Army's new counterinsurgency manual. It was a strategy that emphasized knowing the cultural terrain, getting out and interacting with the people of your battle space. Sometimes, it cautioned, the more you protect your force, the less secure you may be. Some soldiers took this to extremes. In Afghanistan, Major Jim Gant, an officer in the Special Forces, would occasionally stop military matters to play with local children in the town where he'd been stationed. He later claimed, "I would play with the children for hours. I often thought that these play sessions did more for our cause in Konar than all the raids we did combined." This was premised on a sociological rather than a physical conception of security. And this is the reason that I was in that little town south of Fallujah in the first place. An alliance of Sunni sheikhs, the real power players in the region, had decided to oppose the Islamic State and cooperate with the Americans, enabling the expansion of our expansion into the rural areas where insurgents were fleeing to. The military thus set up outposts to force U.S. units into close physical proximity with the people of Iraq. Admittedly, terrifying the village and kicking families out of their houses in the middle of the night was perhaps not the most auspicious first start. But the general idea was that over time, living in little Iraqi towns, patrolling the streets, getting an intuitive feel for the life of the community, the military would become more than just a looming violent force in the region, but a power player enmeshed in the life of the community. As the Iraq War veteran Matt Gallagher, who served during this time, put it, so little of Iraq had anything to do with guns or bombs or jihads. That's what people never understand. There was the desert, and the locals, and their lives. In practice, this meant not a series of clear-cut raids in which good and brave soldiers kill bad and depraved terrorists, and the world is made progressively safer one bullet at a time, but a series of complex negotiations whose success or failure depends on much more than the ability of each side to wreak violence. I'll give you an example. In 2010, a Special Forces officer named Ian Fishback was stationed in Diyala province when a group of Sunni tribesmen launched a few mortars at his base. Mortar attacks generally weren't particularly serious. Fishback often slept through them, but in this case, the shrapnel from the rounds ripped out the throats of 2 service members, both of whom quickly bled to death. Because of his knowledge of the area, Fishback was pretty sure he knew which tribe the mortarmen came from, and who was the sheikh, nominally in charge. Most U.S. commanders would have at the very least arrested the sheikh, interrogated him, and tried to bring people for justice. This is not what Fishback did. He was operating in a volatile region, and he saw his job less as one of pacifying an insurgency than working out some kind of settlement between the competing groups that would allow them to live together peacefully. The process was primarily political, he told me, with violence in the background. Most of it was about reconciliation and politics. I don't think we ever killed anybody. On the one side were the Sunni tribes, who felt threatened by Kurdish incursions into their territory. On the other side were the Kurds, who had controlled the region until the late 80s when Saddam Hussein waged a genocidal campaign that killed up to about 180,000 people and then resettled Sunni tribes in the devastated territory. The Kurds, understandably, were not particularly sympathetic to Sunni grievances. And so, during his deployment, Fishback had served to open lines of communication between the various groups, operating as an outside force who could limit the uncertainty each side felt in negotiating with the other. He mapped out 550 nodes of power in the region, people with influence who could play a role in possible reconciliation, and he worked to help the local leaders build institutions which could, in the event of U.S. departure, help keep the peace. And he felt he was being successful. He had sheikhs who'd fought in the insurgency for almost 10 years, guys who'd never met an American before who were willing to work with him. There was no descent into general violence. But then there were these mortar attacks. 2 American dead, the sort of thing that requires a response. Fishback called a meeting with the sheikh, and the sheikh agreed to come. Prior to the meeting, Fishback knew the sheikh probably had blood on his hands at some point in the past 10 years. He knew the sheikh probably knew who had launched the mortars, or at least knew enough to be able to help Fishback track him down if he wanted. He knew that the sheikhs in the region didn't have absolute control of their tribesmen, that tribesmen often felt that attacking Americans conferred legitimacy, and that even tribal leaders who genuinely wanted to work with the Americans often turned a blind eye to the occasional mortar attack, which usually didn't kill anybody, and so were mostly a harmless way for their men to get a shot in at the Americans, usually. He came in clearly very nervous, Fishback told me. It was common practice among some people to detain sheikhs during those meetings, but I was in a position of establishing peace. Detaining him had the potential to undermine relations with the other Sunni sheikhs. So I made it clear, if this happens again, we won't be friends. And he knew what that meant. The interpreter thought he was going to have a heart attack. And that was it. Fishback made the decision to forego a hard approach seeking justice for 2 needlessly dead Americans, on behalf of the hope that continuing his relationship with the sheikh would lead to better outcomes down the road. This is not a great war story to tell in a bar. It doesn't have the clean trajectory of a sniper's bullet, the satisfying moral conclusion of the Osama bin Laden raid, or the awe-inspiring display of force in the Second Battle of Fallujah. It's not even really possible to know whether it was the right choice, whether that particular sheikh was as reconcilable as Fishback thought he was, or whether any of it mattered in the long term. That year, Iraq would have bitterly disputed elections, followed by the Shia prime minister going after Sunni politicians, igniting yet another round of vicious sectarian warfare in which ISIS was able to successfully woo the support of Sunni tribesmen away from their leaders. Once you move outside the realm of physical force and into the realm of social power, you move into the realm of uncertainty. Each action of yours sparks a chain of reactions among the people you're trying to influence, reactions that all the social science in the world and all the mapping of nodes of power cannot predict. As Hannah Arendt pointed out, the reason why we are never able to foretell with certainty the outcome and end of any action is simply that action has no end. The smallest act, in the most limited circumstances, bears the seed of the same boundlessness, because one deed and sometimes one word suffices to change every constellation. There is no sure guide for action, no rule book that will tame a population, because populations are composed of free people with choices of their own to make. The exercise of power, then, as opposed to force, means not dominating an external world, but weaving yourself into a web of relationships in such a way that those around you begin making choices that take your wants and desires into account. That means that power ultimately is not the same as control. It's about submitting to a complex system that is ultimately out of your control, out of any one person's control. So, Fishback can't say that he made the right choice, though he feels that he did. I think it did well for the people, he told me. I think it did well for the prospects for peace, even if those prospects wouldn't come to fruition. When he left the area, the Sunni sheikhs cried. They told the Americans that the reason no one was killed was because of Fishback's team and the way the team conducted itself. On that deployment, Fishback and his men hadn't killed anybody. They hadn't exerted force and turned people into things, but in their own way they had exercised power. Fishback's work, however, was very different from my day job as a media officer. I ran a team of Marine correspondents, assisted professional media moving through Anbar, and served as an advisor on communications. Among my duties, every morning, I had to brief my commanding general on the 3 biggest news stories out of Iraq. And in those early months of 2007, they were never good. It was all chlorine gas attacks and assassinated political leaders and bombers using children as decoys. Eventually, the chief of staff called me aside and he said, "Phil, you're doing good work, but your morning briefings are kind of depressing. How about we add an extra positive news story at the end of each briefing to, pep things up?" This was the beginning of the positive news story of the day, or, because the military loves acronyms, the PSOD, as it came to be called. I'd have 3 horrible stories of violence and despair, and then I'd tell the general, "But for our PSOD, we have an article in the New York Times where John McCain says," yes, sir, John McCain again, "says we're making progress." Some days, though, the news was so overwhelmingly bad, there was almost nothing I could find. No idea what the PSOD's going to be, I'd tell my chief as I pored through the dregs of the internet, coming up with things, though, so pathetically threadbare, it was often worse to include them. "Well, sir," I'd tell the general, "we've got a suicide truck bomb that killed 47 people, the assassination of a tribal leader, a UN report saying that the Iraqi government has engaged in widespread torture, and for our PSOD, from freedommom.blogspot.america.com, look at this adorable photo of a Marine who went on patrol and took a selfie with a baby goat." I'm not sure whether the PSOD ever made anybody in the briefing feel better about things. In fact, searching for the PSOD on dark days troubled me. There were some times when trying to put a positive spin felt obscene. At one point during those early months, a Marine squad raided a house near my base where an execution was taking place. The insurgents had captured a couple of Iraqi soldiers, brutally beaten them, taken a power drill and drilled through their ankles, and then set them up in front of a video camera to be beheaded. It was then that the Marines burst in, killed or captured the insurgents, and freed the Iraqis, who were given medical care and sent to the military hospital on my base. A senior officer reached out to me and told me that this was a really dramatic story that spoke well of the American military, and I should head to the hospital, talk to the doctors, and see if one of the Iraqis was willing to do an interview about what he'd experienced and how grateful he was to the U.S. forces for saving him. And so, naively, I walked over to the hospital and asked to speak to one of the surgeons who'd worked on the tortured Iraqis. This doctor, when I explained why I was there, it took him a moment to respond. He'd spent time with these brutalized men, with their broken bodies, which would never be whole again. And first, he didn't understand what I was after. The notion that this was a good news story was inconceivable. It was one of the worst things he'd ever seen in his life. Evil written on the body. "You don't understand," he said in a strangled voice. "They're in really rough shape." I left ashamed of myself. During this time, as I struggled through these emotions about myself and the place I was in and the work I was doing, I went to church and I went to confession. And in confession, I mostly talked about my sense of my own inadequacy. Here I was, in a sight of deep moral concern. People were dying, people were being tortured to death, and I had joined the military to be of service. In high school, the Jesuits had taught me to be a man for others. The Marine Corps had promised me a way to do that, and so here I was. And yet, as a staff officer, especially as a staff officer with a job related to media, it was difficult to square my day-to-day activities with the life and death stakes all around me. I didn't even know if I was helping or hurting the cause. Most of the outside journalists that I brought into Anbar province tended to report only bad news. All I knew was that I had a safe job in a dangerous place, the sort of place where moral heroism was definitely needed, but where I didn't have the slightest clue as to what that moral heroism would even look like. Faith, for me, has always been a place to register a sense of doubt, of powerlessness, of inadequacy and uncertainty about my place in the world and how I'm supposed to live. You kneel before a cross, before a broken, tortured, and humiliated human body. You face human frailty and human cruelty. You call to mind your sins, all that you've done and all that you've failed to do, in a place where you know that nevertheless you are accepted and forgiven. Those early days in Iraq were so busy, it was easy to get lost in the constant flow of work, but my time at Mass, particularly my time in confession, were when time stopped, and I tried to imagine ways of reordering myself in relation to this very disordered, broken world. Then I poured out my doubts, received reconciliation, and went back to my confusing day job. However, April 29th, a week after I came back from those little combat outposts in those little towns south of Fallujah, the New York Times ran a story about the Anbar Awakening by Kirk Semple, a reporter I'd helped when he passed through. The article, Uneasy Alliances Taming One Insurgent Bastion, was the first major piece of reporting from a reputable source on the Anbar Awakening, which was that alliance of sheikhs I mentioned before, that, backed by U.S. military might, was changing the power structure in Anbar and challenging the Islamic State. In the article, Semple did a careful job of explaining what the awakening did and didn't signify, pointing out that the alliance was an uneasy marriage of convenience, that many of the sheikhs had participated in the insurgency, that government remained a wreck, and so on. The article ended with the suggestion that, barring an eventual political settlement, the long-term effect of the awakening might simply be to arm and organize a potential enemy to the Iraqi state. Nevertheless, he noted that in Ramadi the insurgency was on the run. And at that time in the war, for an article in the New York Times, that was a peace-odd. That was as peace-oddy as it got. And so my war started to turn. Soon more and more journalists were passing through Anbar province, interested in covering the changes in Ramadi or in the operation that would soon start in Fallujah. A steady stream of casualties still poured through our base, but it wasn't like before. Mortar attacks stopped. At a certain point, I couldn't remember the last mass casualty event. I saw less injured children. And I went from hope that we were winning to certainty. It became a matter of statistics. How many patients coming into our military hospital? How many people dying in attacks across Anbar? Looking at the figures, it was easy to imagine a rough utilitarian calculus in which my service was overwhelmingly justified by the changes wrought on the ground. It was seemingly an empirical question. Did fewer people die in Iraq because of the surge? If the answer was yes, which I thought the statistics said. Then, according to that utilitarian consequentialist calculus, I was right and noble, while the anti-war folks who opposed the surge were guilty of risking Iraqi lives. Clausewitz, the great German philosopher of war, might have disagreed. For him, immaterial forces are often the most important forces in war, spirits that, quote, seek to escape from all book knowledge, for they will neither be brought into numbers nor into classes, and want only to be seen and felt. Since war is waged against a living and reacting force, mechanical rules and laws will be perpetually undermined and washed away by the current of opinions, feelings, and customs. Such arguments didn't seem to matter at the time. The sheer power of the data suggested we had indeed found a rule book in which the spirits permeating war had been quantified and tamed. It would only be a few years, though, before those spirits would rebel, and changing political conditions in Iraq lead to the rapid collapse of the awakening and the rise of ISIS. But that was in the future. Not knowing the future, I knew the statistics, the numbers of the dead, the continual decline in violence. Statistics are wonderful. Like force, they turn people into things. For example, in January of 2008, the last full month I spent overseas, 554 Iraqis were killed. This is a horrible number if you think about it in terms of specific people. For example, January 31st, the last day of that month, a woman with Down syndrome walked through a checkpoint to a pet market. She claimed she had birds to sell, but in fact she had bombs strapped to her body. Bombs she may not have even been aware were there. Within minutes, a remote trigger man detonated her in a flash of fire and blood and feathers. Survivors would describe awakening from the blast covered in blood, not knowing whether it was their blood, human blood, or the blood of animals. One man searched for his friend Zaki amongst the various species of corpses until he passed out and woke up in a hospital bed. This incident left 46 dead. But when I thought of them, I didn't think of the individual experiences. I imagined a spreadsheet counting Iraqi casualties, a spreadsheet in which those 46 dead were numbers 482 to 527. A later blast, also from a bomb-carrying woman with Down syndrome, would bring the total for that month to 554, which, when stacked against the previous January's 1,802 Iraqi deaths, was a relatively low number, which is the most pleasant way to think about it. So I left Iraq untroubled, confident. I came home untroubled, confident. Yes, soldiers had died. Yes, civilians had died. Yes, bodies had been torn and rent, and I had even seen some of those bodies. There were images that stuck in my mind, like a man's eyeballs flattened and covered in red cloth, like a father and mother holding an injured baby and looking on her with sorrow and love, like a young Marine's tattoo as he lay on a trauma table. But from my secure vantage point, as an officer on a general staff following the big picture news of the war, it was easy to anesthetize myself to such things or to think about them in a sentimental way. The soldier whose name I didn't know was sacrificing for a good cause. The injured civilians who I didn't know were an example of why that cause was so good and our enemy so evil. As I said, my soul was mostly untroubled. In theory, war is supposed to enhance one's faith, or at the very least force a deep sense of reflection upon spiritual matters. War experience and trauma, more generally, can be an assault not only on one's physical sense of safety, but on one's social, moral, and spiritual conception of the world. Recovery, as the psychiatrist Judith Herman has described it, challenges the ordinary person to become a theologian, a philosopher, and a jurist, who must reconstruct a view of faith, society, and ethics that won't merely collapse into the emptiness of the evil they've experienced. Faith in God, faith in people, faith in the immaterial aspects of life which we rely on to go about our day-to-day existence need to be rebuilt. And though many do not turn to God seeking aid in the process, for those who do, their faith can emerge stronger than ever. But this was not my situation, which was comfortable, not particularly traumatic, and seemingly justified by external events that didn't have so much to do with me. And so I stopped going to Mass. It wasn't a conscious decision. It would be a year before I would admit to a woman I was dating that I no longer believed in God. It was more that I simply stopped feeling the need to trouble myself about my spiritual life. As the numbers went more and more in the right direction, I felt less and less like I was in a place of mystery and confusion, but in a rational, controllable world where the correct application of right thinking and right technique could tame chaos, tame the wild spirits of war and civic life, and move us closer to a progressive, technocratically managed ideal of democracy and peace. I was less bothered by the war, by my place in it, and by the challenge of living justly in response to tragedy, than what I viewed as the shallow and wrong-headed political debates about the war back home, by the politicians I thought were lying about the facts, from Rahm Emanuel accusing General Petraeus of using creative statistics to Hillary Clinton suggesting it took a suspension of disbelief to accept what he was telling Congress. My understanding not simply of the war, but of myself shifted. I was not a fallen creature in a broken world reliant on grace, but a Marine in a successful army that had all the answers. I was justified not by a cross, but by an interpretation of public policy, not by the cruel and barbaric torture and murder of an innocent man, but by politics. If the surge had saved lives, turning a monthly death toll of 1,802 to 554, then the month of January didn't just make me right and the anti-war folks who'd opposed the policy wrong, it made me morally better than them by exactly 1,248 dead Iraqis. It did not occur to me that I could be right about public policy and still be a sinner, or wrong about public policy and still be saved. And so I set aside the moments of doubt. I set aside the experiences that gave me pause. Like, for example, that moment that I stood in a small Iraqi town, a town I thought I knew everything about, stared down a street, and heard a voice, my voice, saying, "I do not know where I am, or what I am doing, or what we are doing, and none of the Marines around me do either." In 2009, I left the Corps and returned home. Very quickly, I developed a sense that something was missing from my life in New York. In an odd way, it was similar to that invisible force I'd felt in that small town, the force that existed for the inhabitants, but separated me from them. Joining the Marine Corps, you see, is not just taking on a new job. It's about entering an entirely different culture, one that in many ways echoes the nature and character of religious life. "A modern man may well find his monastery in the military," Samuel Huntington wrote in 1957, and I certainly found that to be the case. Like a novice monk, I was given new clothing, new standards of dress, a new haircut, as well as a distinct role within a broader community. I was given a list of virtues I was meant to embody, virtues like honor, courage, and commitment, taking the place of the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. I went through rituals that marked the stages of life and the passage of power, swearing the oath of office, promotion ceremonies, award ceremonies, and of course, memorial services. I was given a formalized language to use in chants and songs and shouted group responses. I was told that class, wealth, and race don't make a difference here. I was told to embrace austerity and mortification of the flesh. I was submerged into communal living and told that we were all expected to give our bodies and our lives if the need should arise. I was given the stories of, well, they don't call them saints, but it's basically the same. Men and women who risked their lives under enemy fire, who jumped on hand grenades to save their buddies, who held faith with their fellow prisoners of war during years of torture. And the whole thing was sanctified with the blood of sacrificial figures, the fallen Marines who came before and gave their lives to the cause. Out of the Corps, I was deprived of that community and that system of meaning, and yet not fully absorbed into the civilian world, which of course has its own rites and rituals and myths. Many of them accepted unconsciously. I was alienated, as so many veterans have been before. There's nothing new or especially dramatic about this. Plenty of veterans have come home and felt the same. Here are these incomprehensible people living absurd lives without a thought in their head about the real world. And the real world, for some reason, didn't mean the lives and families and hopes and dreams of ordinary men and women. It meant the war. It meant the stuff I cared about. As one Vietnam veteran put it, I could not fathom how Vietnam could be anything to all Americans but the central concern of their lives, how it could be anything less than the dark sun around which we are all in unbreakable orbit as its doomed and somehow hopeless satellite. To walk through a city like New York upon return from war then felt like witnessing a moral crime. Much as in Iraq, we were frustrated that the Iraqis didn't just give up their own lives and goals and embrace our vision of democracy. I was frustrated coming home that the American people did not embrace my vision of war. This was something I wanted to solve by writing fiction. I wanted to tell the oblivious American public what they needed to know. At first, my grand ideas were primarily psychological and moral and political. I thought I would write a novel about PTSD and therefore show a shamefaced nation what they had asked their Marines to bear. I would write about the dramatic suffering of soldiers and contrast that with the empty materialism of modern American life. I would write about the apathy of the broader American public around issues of war and peace. I, the authoritative, returned veteran, would deliver my hard truths to a public which had failed in its civic duties. This was not so much about reconciling the civilian and military worlds, and much less about reconciling the narrow experience of war within the broader social reality of the towns and villages where that war was fought, but about preaching from a great height. It's somewhat amusing now that I thought at the time that those were the things missing from the public conversation. There were plenty of people writing about those things, plenty of them much more knowledgeable than myself. But like many young writers, I was eager to regurgitate the culture back at itself. So that was one motivation. But there was another messier motivation which I couldn't quite have articulated at the time. It was less about a message to unload upon my reader and more about a group of unquiet memories which hung around in my head, cluttering up the place without serving as fodder for an easily digestible moral of the sort I wanted to impart. They were memories like the following. How funny it could be to talk about dead bodies. What it looked like seeing dirty soldiers back from patrol eating cherry cobbler in the TQ mess hall. The voice of that doctor as he told me what it had felt like treating those 2 tortured Iraqis. Watching a man shepherd a group of sick sheep with mucus hanging from their snouts, and the adjustment men made in the summer months to deal with ball sweat. And because I was writing fiction, and not weekly opinion pieces, the odd, unquiet memories began to win. Fiction is strangled by simple messages, by notions of justice dependent on statistics where, as Gabriel Marcel put it, every individual is reducible to an index card that can be sent to a central office, or perhaps to Facebook's algorithm. But fiction thrives on sick sheep and ball sweat. Stories are things that happen not to ideas or statistics, but to people with bodies in specific places. And so unconsciously and simply by the form my writing took, I began to undermine my own certainty. Also, around this time, people I knew were injured. A few people I respected were betrayed by the Marine Corps, treated badly and callously and cruelly. 2 Marines I knew and liked experienced periods of homelessness. A bitterly disputed parliamentary election in Iraq threatened security gains. And so, without quite knowing why, I went back to Mass for the first time in years. And I thought about how the world was not meeting my hopeful expectations. And Christ, looking back at me from the cross, blood dripping from the thorns in his crown and the wound in his side and the nails in his hands and his feet, asked, "What on earth convinced you that it would?" In the book of Job, after the hero has been stricken with illness, suffered the death of his children and his servants, he asks to make his case before the Lord, to ask what he has done to merit such suffering. And the Lord does respond to him, speaking out of the whirlwind, but instead of giving answers, he offers rhetorical questions. At first, they're about what Job knows of the world. Where were you when I founded the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its sides? Who laid its cornerstone? And then God switches to a set of questions about what God can do, what he can control. If he can thunder with a voice like God's, humiliate the proud, bury them in dust. And he ends with the famous image of the Leviathan, later used by Thomas Hobbes as an image of the state itself, as an image of that vast conglomeration of people that form a civic body. God asks, can you lead Leviathan about with a hook, or tie down his tongue with a rope? Can you put a ring into his nose, or pierce through his cheek with a gaff? Will he then plead with you time after time, or address you with tender words? Will he make a covenant with you that you may have him as a slave forever? Can you play with him as with a bird? Can you tie him up for your little girls? It increasingly seems to me that the certainty of my earlier life was based on fantasies of an orderly future and a rational, controllable world. Fantasies that are no more than the wish that the Leviathan might one day be tied down by force, that man, with his ever-increasing sophistication and technology, could come up with a set of rules about how states are to be built, how societies are to be governed, how men are to be made to live, that would allow us to lead the Leviathan of the state, the city, the town with a hook, tie its tongue down with a rope, and make of it and men a slave. And so, though I struggle with faith, faith not only in God, but in my country, my church, and my fellow men, I go to Mass. I return to doubt and confusion and uncertainty. I return to a social gathering, to a meal, to the experience of music, to the image of our tortured God, the recitation of words, to that moment when everybody in the church trips over the phrase consubstantial with the Father, to the hands of my fellow congregants offering me peace, to the inscription of the cross on the forehead, lips, and heart. I return to the physical expression of a broader social body which proclaims itself a mystical body, each one of us branches emanating from the vine that is Christ. I return to a place designed to pull me out of my individualistic American brain and situate me back inside my skin and inside a community with all the raucous contradictions and odd harmonies that implies. Paul tells us the kingdom of God is not in a word, but in power. And at times, I think I can feel that power around me. Catholicism is not, or should not be, a religion of force, not of hard mechanical rules, but of stories and paradoxes and enigmatic parables. It is an invitation to mystery, not mastery, and communion, not control. It is a religion that fits with what I know of reality, that helps me live honestly, and that helps me set aside my dreams of a less atavistic world, in which men follow rational orders and never rebel. Perfect obedience, after all, comes not from men, but from machines. Fantasies of control are fantasies of ruling over the dead, and my tortured God is not a God of death, but of new life. Thank you.
On behalf of St. Thomas More and America Media, thank you, Phil, for your own insights and reflections on the gifts and challenges of faith in a difficult point in your own memory and a difficult point in our history. Thank you for your gift of writing and being part of the Catholic imagination. Thank you to all of you for attending this lecture. His books will be for sale in the hallway, and he will be in the front of the room to sign books and to greet people after. Thank you.